All right, the sun never sets on the British Empire. So this is, of course, a very famous line that maybe many of you have heard before, and it was literally true in the 1800s. The sun never set on the British Empire because they had colonies everywhere. And so this lecture today is going to be primarily on colonization, right? And the whole story of colonization in the 1800s. So be precise, 19th century colonization and the stories behind it. So let's set it up, what I want you to know on this lecture. Uh, and here we have a kind of our setup. So we need to know the causes of colonization. That's going to be the first step. What are the causes? What are the motivations? What are the justifications of colonization? Then we're going to talk about colonization in Africa, colonization in Asia, and the global impacts. So, one of the things about this period of time, the sun never sets on the British Empire, it's an incredibly, again, optimistic statement if you're part of the British Empire. If you're living in these European powers, this is again part of that optimism that I've been talking about, right? We've had the unification of Italy and Germany, we've had industrialization, we've had the progressive years. If you're being colonized, not such a good time for you. So, in this lecture, more so than any other lecture I think I've done up to this point, the impacts aren't really going to be in Europe. The impacts are going to be in Asia and Africa, and so forth, a little bit in Latin America, even. We'll get into that. But it all starts from events in Europe. So, that's what you want to focus on this lecture. Yes, you want to know the causes. You're going to want to know how Africa was colonized. There are basically three methods used to colonize Africa. You're going to want to know each method, where it was used, the impacts of each method. You're going to want to know all the impacts colonization had on Asia as well. So when you're thinking about, the essays or anything related to the ideas about colonization, you're really thinking in this lecture from a really global perspective, because it's not just what happens in Europe, it's what happens around the globe. So I hope all that's clear. So that's essentially what we're going to do here. And we'll start, of course, with the causes. That makes sense. So here's just our maps that we're going to get into. And I'll show you these maps again as we go through the lectures. But basically, everything you see colored on these maps are areas of European powers colonizing Africa and Asia, respectively. So you can see basically all of Africa is colonized and a good chunk of Asia is colonized in the 1800s. So again, we have to understand why they do this and what are the motivations, justifications they gave at the time, and then we'll talk about the processes itself of colonizing Asia and Africa and the impacts of them. So we'll come back to these maps in more detail later on, but I just wanted to start by showing you what we're going to be working with. And again, you have these in your books, and you're always, that's another good resource for you. So here we have our list of the causes, as we sometimes say causes, sometimes I use the word motivation, sometimes I even use the word justifications. In other words, how did they justify colonization at the time? So we have economic, that's definitely one of the big causes. And what I mean by economic is, remember, this is during the Industrial Revolution period. And so during the Industrial Revolution, you want raw materials. And so you have a lot of raw materials in place places like Africa. So they look for the rubber, the oil, the metals, anything that they have there that might help fuel the industrial revolution. So for some people that was a motivation. There were other economic causes as well. And if you remember when we lectured on the Industrial Revolution, I said one of the impacts of the Industrial Revolution is colonization. Well, therefore, one of the causes of colonization is the Industrial Revolution. It's also about selling all your stuff. And so there are a lot of markets to be had. There's a lot of people in Asia that you may want to open up those markets to trade and sell all your things. And now, obviously, this is still a very prevalent idea today in a global manner where we're always talking about opening up markets. You hear things about tariffs, you hear things about, trade balances and who's selling more stuff to who. And it's important. It actually impacts our economy every single day today. So understanding this is where you get a lot of the root of that is very important. This is where you get this global trade and global markets that are going to become very important all the way until today. So anyway, so that's very important. So economics. So that was one motivation why people might go and try to colonize Africa or parts of Asia. So I hope that's clear. Other than economic and kind of group industrial revolution and raw materials there together, there was religion. For some people, they wanted to colonize because they didn't care about making money, but they thought they were doing God's work of missionary type of work. There's a lot of missionary people that they generally believe that the people in these other areas of the world were not exposed to the Christian faith enough, and if they expose them to Christian faith, it could help them with salvation. So there was some people who were motivated to colonize for religious reasons. I think definitely the economic motivation was much bigger. One way people justified colonization is with this idea known as white man's burden. I don't know if you've ever heard this before, but it's just like it sounds, white man's burden, that it is the job of the white man in Europe to go to these other places and elevate them because these other places are backwards and stupid and unable to do things well, and it's our responsibility to do this. This is, of course, a very racist idea that was very dominant in the 1800s. But this was the belief that this is why we should justify. Now, it always leads. Did people really believe this, or were they just using it as an excuse? Probably a little bit of both. There were probably some people who really believed they were somehow doing quote unquote good, and there were other people in it as malarkey. But they said, "Oh, we'll say this to make us feel better about ourselves, or whatever it is, right?" So at the end of the day, that was a motivation as well. In your textbook, you have some sources on this as well. There's a poem about this. So you should read that. Any of the primary sources in your textbook, as always, you want to read them and be able to use those as well in explaining some of this. Another way people tried to justify colonization was this concept of social Darwinism. I think I mentioned this before during the Industrial Revolution. Again, Darwin, not Darwin, but social Darwinism, this idea of survival of the fittest applying to people. And basically, their argument was, well, we're stronger, we advanced, they didn't. So we're going to go ahead and colonize as well it should be because that's quote unquote the way nature intends it, social Darwinism. So that was how some people justified this colonization period. So there was that. Strategic reasons. In the 1800s, there's some people said, well, we need to colonize for strategic reasons. We need these islands. We need this for a military base. Think of Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. I mean, why did we colonize Hawaii? Because Pearl Harbor, right? That was a very important place to put a naval base. It's right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And you're going to see a lot of this between these European powers, especially as you get the unification of Italy and the unification of Germany, and all these powers are industrializing and they're all becoming really big powers. If you're England and you're worried about Russia, or you're worried about Germany or whatever, you're going to say, I better get that piece of real estate because if I don't, somebody else will, and they could be a threat to my civilization. So definitely for some people, with strategic reasons. And then there was also kind of this nationalism again. And what I mean by nationalism this time is not the state of mind rising out of awareness of being part of a community, that whole definition we talked about before. Instead, I'm thinking more along the line of kind of national pride for people. Sometimes I describe colonization as kind of like the Olympic Games for people back then, in the sense that, when you watch the Olympics, even if you don't like them very much, you don't like sports very much, the first thing everybody checks is the medal count, right? And do we have more medals than whatever country we're pissed off on that particular cycle of the Olympics? And if we do, yay, and if we don't, boo, right? Well, that's kind of what colonization is for some of these countries. It's like, I'm going to colonize because I want more pieces of real estate than the other country. And then there were even some countries like England and stuff that said, well, we should colonize instead of other countries because we'll do it better. And as crazy as this is going to sound, there's actually something to that. Because when we talk about colonization, not all colonization was equal. Sometimes I put it this way. There were kind of three forms of colonization: bad, worse, and evil. None, if you're being colonized, none of it is good, right? Obviously, if you're the person being colonized, it's not good. You're being occupied, it's not good. By the way, I also mentioned this point because sometimes we hear this word of, occupation. It's such a negative term, and normally it is. But is there any time when you think about this critically? Sometimes I like to throw things out to make people think. Is there ever a time where it's okay to occupy another country? And you're thinking, oh, it doesn't sound like it's a good idea. All right, we occupied Germany after World War II. Very few people would say that was a bad idea. Now, there were reasons for that, of course, right? There were reasons because we wanted to make sure the Nazi threat was gone and we weren't going to see a rise of Nazism or of that again. So, there are times when you do occupy a nation because of just reasons, but that was not what was happening in the 1800s. This was not because some country in Africa or in Asia was a global threat. These are things that were being done because the people then simply wanted, again, the economics, the raw materials, and these other ideas I just mentioned. So there's definitely some of that going on. So those are the reasons, those are the motivations that people colonizing. All right, so I hope all that's clear. And now we're going to start the process. And so we're going to start with Africa. And there are actually 3 different methods used to colonize Africa. So I kind of created a slide for each one of them. And I'm going to kind of go in that order I mentioned, bad, worse, and evil. And for each method, you're going to want to know the same thing. So I think I'll go to the next slide and it'll make more sense. All right. So let's talk about the British, right? So the British are going to colonize the colonization of Africa. So for each of these methods, you want to know where. Okay, so where do the British colonize? What parts of Africa? Well, they're going to colonize North Africa and South Africa. So areas like Egypt, areas like, of course, South Africa itself. And those are the regions that Egypt is going to colonize. And I'm sorry, the British are going to colonize. And the style that the British use, each of them kind of has a style or a term. I simply call it the British model. Why? So what is the British model? You want to know this. When the British go and colonize these areas, they take them over, but what they at least do is when they colonize, they build up infrastructure in these areas. They build up schools. They allow people to have their own local rulers. They usually let people keep their way of life and their religion and their customs. In other words, they don't go into these areas and tell people you all have to change and we're going to kill you all. We're not building any resources. They're not doing that. Now, if you fight against them, they're going to push back. If you resist, they're going to push back. Again, it's not good. But compared to the next 2 methods we're going to see, this was much better for the time period of the mid-1800s when this was happening. And so why does all this matter that the British use that style? They build up the schools, they build up the hospitals, they build up the infrastructure, they allow the locals to govern themselves to some degree, but the resources, of course, all go into the British Crown, right? Why does this matter? Because eventually you get what we call decolonization. So you have to understand this as well. What is decolonization? Well, decolonization, exactly like it sounds. When we get into after World War II, 1950s and 60s, these European powers that colonize Africa leave. They go, okay, we don't belong here, we're leaving. What happens when they leave? Well, for each method, you're going to have a very different result. And for the British style, when they left, you see these 2 statistics. I'm going to use the same 2 statistics for every example. So when you look at literacy rates around the year 1990, circa 1990, and why did I pick 1990 when I did this? Because it's like, well, today's 2020. Why are we using 1990? Because 1990 is like 2 generations later. It's 2 generations after they left, 2, almost 3 generations. So it gives you enough time where, okay, they're gone. They've kind of had a chance to develop themselves without this firm control of these colonizations. What happens? Well, they do okay there. Literacy rates are about 80%, and LE, that's just short for life expectancy, so get that down. Life expectancy rates are about 70 years of age. Not horrible, right? Now, I don't want you to think it was all smooth when the British left and there were no conflicts and there were no issues. Of course, South Africa had that horrible period of apartheid. And so there was a mess there. But at least in terms of the next 2 methods, this wasn't as horrible. It's not good, right? You don't want anybody to say, oh, it's good. No, it's not good. But now, if you're the British, again, from the British perspective, hey, this is great. We're colonizing, we're getting resources. So it's always, what perspective you're looking at things from oftentimes matter when you're studying any major historical event like this. So anyway, so that's the British colonization of Africa. Know it and understand the decolonization issue as well. Okay, so I hope all that's clear. We don't spend a lot of time on each of them, but you need to know each of them. Let's talk about the French colonization of Africa. And this is sometimes what I've heard it called assimilation style. What parts of Africa do the French colonize? Well, Northwest Africa, so this whole area up here. that you see, French West Africa. And so those would be countries like Algeria, Morocco, those areas there, Tunisia, and then also this little island, Madagascar. It's not that little, big island there, Madagascar, on the clear other side. And I call it assimilation. Why? Because when the French colonized these areas, they basically try to assimilate those people. Learn French, right? We're gonna build skills, but everyone's got to learn French here. We're gonna have a more direct control of people's lives here than the British gave you in these other areas. And so that's why if you actually go to a lot of these countries to this day, and you go to a lot of areas in Northwest Africa, people still speak French. It's still a very common language in a lot of these areas because of the French colonization. In terms of what happens when they decolonize, well, it's not going to be as good as the British because they didn't get a chance to have more self-governing the way the British did. So there's going to be a little bit more instability. Literacy rates around 1990 are closer to about 60%, and life expectancy is closer to about 60 years of age. So, not that great. So that's the French colonization, that's assimilation. So again, for each method, you're kind of getting the same points, right? Where they colonized, what's the method style, what did they do, and then the decolonization ramifications. Because again, the whole point of this lecture is impacts, 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 but you're looking at the impacts, in this case, in Africa, right? And so you want to distinguish which parts of Africa. So you have that. All right. Next, Belgian colonization of Africa. So again, I said there's bad, there's worse, and guys, this is the evil. So what did Belgium do? And this is also Portugal did some of this as well, but I usually use Belgium as the example. This is called paternalism. And what does that word paternalism sound like? Father figure. And what they would do, the people in Belgium, is essentially tell the people in the central part of Africa, so Central Africa, around the area of what is the Congo region there, that you guys are children. But you are children that are incapable of learning. And this was very much led by this man named Leopold II. Leopold II is probably the luckiest man in history because he is kind of up there with some of the worst individuals in human history, and very few people know about him. So I always want to make sure his name becomes infamous in history as well as deserved to be, because he didn't just go in and colonize the areas there. He massacred people there. He brutalized people there. He basically sends the Belgian forces in there, rapes the resources, takes everything he needs. No schools, no education, no infrastructure, no self-governing. Why would you do that? If you believe they're stupid children who can never be taught. Guys, this is even worse than white man's burden, right? White man's burden, as horrible as that sounds, is an idea that, well, we're going to lift you up. This idea is you are so stupid you can't even be lifted up. That's what paternalism is. I want you to wrap your brain around this. So what do you think is going to happen when they leave? Well, it's going to be chaos. They have no idea of governing, no idea of self-authority, no economic systems, no educational systems. And so when you look at these same numbers in 1990, look at the literacy rate. It's about 10%. About the 10% of the people there can read and write. Life expectancy is about 30 years of age. And if all that wasn't bad enough, then what happens when you get into the 1990s is this massive tribal warfare that develops. And I don't know if you're familiar with this at all, but in the 1990s, there was a genocide in the central part of Africa between what we call the Hutus and the Tutsis. So what's the deal with this? Well, the Tutsis and Hutus were two people living in Rwanda region. And the Tutsis were the minority group, and the Tutsis were in control for a long time. So what did the Hutus do? Well, the Hutus just decided that since the Tutsis controlled most of the power, the Hutus decided they're just going to kill them. And the Hutus went and rounded up the Tutsis and killed them in masses. And this is sometimes, not sometimes, but is known as the Rwanda genocide. There was a movie called Hotel Rwanda. If you've never seen that movie, it's a really good movie many years ago. Kind of talks about this event. So it's still very unstable in this area, even in 2020. And in many respects, it's very unstable in much of Africa today, not in just central part of Africa. There's also the issue of the AIDS epidemic, which has ravished Africa in the last 20, 30 years. So it's a very difficult situation for people in a lot of these regions. I found a very interesting article. This was years ago about this current situation in Africa. And it was from a person living in Africa and an economist. And one of the things that's happened, from about the year 2000 onward, is a lot of United States and Western powers poured a lot of aid into Africa, tremendous amount of aid, money, resources. And on the surface, people go, well, isn't that good? Isn't that going to help them? And one of the issues that this man from Africa was writing about, I remember the title of the article was "Stop the Aid." And you go, why would you want to stop the aid? And what he was saying in this article was that the aid is actually making people in Africa too dependent on the West and is not giving them an opportunity to be free, to develop their own infrastructure, to develop their own literacy, to develop their own stability. And as long as they keep relying on Europeans and the United States to provide them aid, they're never going to be able to rise up, which I thought was a very interesting article from somebody from Africa, right? If I can, I'll try, maybe if I can find it, I'll try to link it to you guys. It was an old article, but it was still really good. I'll try to find a link. If I can link it to you, I will. Okay. So anyway, so that's the colonization in Africa. So all very important there. Make sure you need to know all about that. All right, so those are the three methods. So I think we'll kind of just break this up again into a couple lectures. And so I'm just going to continue on the next part with the colonization into Asia and get into that discussion. So I hope all that's very clear. Thank you.